Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now. I'm your host, David Myers, director of the Luskin Center for History and Policy, which sponsors this podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the extraordinary political crisis that has enveloped the city of Los Angeles since the release several weeks ago of the leaked tape involving city councilors Nury Martinez, Kevin De Leon, and Gil Cedillo, along with labor leader Ron Herrera. There are many strands to this story, chief among them the astonishing, searing racism expressed by the councilors, the nature of interethnic relations in the city, especially between Latinos and African Americans, and the distribution of political power in the city. Much has been said and written about this episode, but today we're going to dig deeply into the past and present of city politics and the place of Latinos in the racial and ethnic mosaic of Los Angeles. I'm delighted to speak today with two distinguished experts who can indeed add real depth to the ongoing discussion. First is Miguel Santana, who has played key roles in the public and nonprofit sectors in Southern California. Miguel served as Deputy Chief Executive Officer for Los Angeles County, and then as the City Administrative Officer for the City of Los Angeles, where he oversaw, amongst other tasks, the city's $9 billion budget. After leaving the government sector, he served as President and CEO of Fairplex, a community benefit regional organization based in Pomona, and since 2021, he has served as President and CEO of the Weingart Foundation, which works to advance racial, social, and economic justice in Southern California. Welcome, Miguel.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great seeing both of you.
Our second guest is Gary Segura, who is Dean of the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, and I'm happy to say, a member of the Board of Advisors of the Luskin Center for History and Policy. Gary is a widely acclaimed and influential political scientist whose work has focused on issues of political representation and social cleavages, with a particular interest in the growing Latino minority in this country. Among his many publications is a 2014 book with UCLA colleague Matt Barreto called Latino America: How America's Most Dynamic Population is Poised to Transform the Politics of the Nation. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Great. So, Gary, in thinking of the book that I just mentioned that you wrote with Matt Barreto and others, can you set the frame for us by narrating the larger national story of Latino political transformation over the past several decades? What have been the most salient trends that you identified?
Growth, growth, and growth. So when Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States, about 4.5% of the national population was Latino or of Latin American ancestry. And today, properly counted, probably creeping up on 20%. So it's a completely different demographic reality, and as a consequence, a somewhat, but not completely different political reality. So that's the first thing I would say. The second is that many people have misconceptions about the Latino population, one of which is that immigration is driving our population growth. Actually, for more than a decade, our population growth has largely been driven by live births in the United States and not by immigration. The median age of Latinos, about 27 years old, is 10 years younger than that of African Americans and about 15 years younger than whites, which means it's a very young population. And over 90% of Latinos under the age of 18 were born in this country as natural-born citizens of the United States. So that actually means that Latino political power over the course of the last 30 years has grown, but it's nothing compared to the way it is likely to grow in the next 30 years, just simply through the passage of time. There's a set of politics and forces that would work to prevent that, and I don't want to understate that, but the growth potential is definitely there. So that's the background in which all of this is happening.
And just as long as you've offered that enticing prospect, what do demographers actually expect to see over the next quarter century or so?
I think that depends on the assumptions you make about fertility. So probably climbing up in the neighborhood of 25 28%. It's not, and that would be over the next, say, 15 years. It's not clear because what's interesting, of course, is that after people come into the United States, the relative family size will decline over time. And so you have to make some predictions and some intuitive extrapolations on what live births are likely to be. And the other thing is that Latino identity as a concept continues to evolve so that individuals, in some respect, may be less likely to see themselves as Latino in certain communities after the third, fourth, fifth generation, while in other communities more likely. So, and the forces that determine whether someone who's 3 generations, 4 generations in this country sees themselves as Latino, those are political forces and social forces that might have to do with the context around them and kind of things that are happening to them in their daily lives. So it's a little hard to know for sure where that number climbs.
Right. I mean, we're going to drill down and discuss LA in specific in just a bit, but just one more question about the national scene. What about geographic distribution? A common assumption is that Latinos are concentrated in 2 or 3 major sites, California, Texas, Miami. But that's changing quite dramatically, isn't it?
Latinos are the largest minority population in about 35 states. It is a population that has spread all across the United States. We used to think of the Big Five, which were California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Illinois. That is no longer, we have to talk about Nevada and Arizona and Colorado. We have to talk about places like Georgia and Pennsylvania and North Carolina, where Latinos have become politically relevant because of the growth of their population. So it's a very different kind of place. There's great moments in some documentaries I've seen where people are like, I didn't know there were Latinos in Illinois. Well, it turns out now there are Latinos in Iowa and Nebraska and Minnesota.
That national framing is very helpful. And I now want to turn our attention to Los Angeles and to you, Miguel. You've spent a large amount of time working to build coalitions amongst diverse groups in Los Angeles. And when I think of coalitions in the context of the history of Los Angeles political history, I, like many people, think of the Bradley Coalition, which brought together African Americans and West Side Jews, amongst others, to forge a new political alliance that really overthrew the old white establishment represented by Mayor Sam Yorty and elected Tom Bradley mayor. We thought the possibility in 1969, but then it was realized in 1973. I'm curious where Latinos were in that momentous political development. Did they ever make their way into that coalition, or has their exclusion been part of the story that we're actually sitting to talk about now?
So I was just having this conversation with my former boss and friend, County Supervisor Gloria Molina, and she reminded me that in that coalition was council member Ed Roybal, and the very deep alliance that Councilman Tom Bradley had with Councilman Ed Roybal, championing many issues of justice and equity at that time, and that he played a central role in supporting the candidacy of Mayor Tom Bradley within the Latino community and beyond.
The pioneering Latino politician, first Latino elected to city council in Los Angeles in 1949.
And sought to run for supervisor. Some believe that he won, but it was denied to him through fraud. And then, of course, ran for Congress and successfully represented much of the East Side for decades. And so he is in many ways the trunk of sort of the Latino political family tree. And so many Latino elected officials sort of stem from the branches that he created. And Gloria also reminded me of the very close relationship she had with Tom Bradley. He supported her candidacy for the city council at a time that the Latino establishment did not. And when she became councilwoman, she considered him a very strong supporter of the work that she led, and he supported her when she ran for supervisor. So, Tom Bradley had a very expansive umbrella, and many Latino leaders in business, in civic society here in Los Angeles really were part of that umbrella that he helped create in many different areas.
Okay, well, I'm going to now talk back to Gary and get his take on what things look like maybe from that point or a little bit later in terms of that operative concept in your 2014 book, Gary, transformation. So what political and demographic transformations do we see in Los Angeles over, say, the last, since the election of Tom Bradley, but certainly over the last quarter century or so? You've cast this wide, broad picture of very significant demographic transformation, which brings with it very substantial political consequences. What does that look like when we scale back down to Los Angeles?
Well, for starters, I mean, the presence of Latinos in the city's business leadership, its philanthropic leadership, and its political circles has changed dramatically. That we can talk about Ed Roybal as sort of the lone voice, or Gloria Molina as the first and lone supervisor, although there's still just the one district. That we've had a pretty substantial change in terms of the place of Latinos in Los Angeles civic life. I do want to draw one sort of important distinction in how coalition politics works, because Los Angeles, it's difficult to extrapolate from Los Angeles to the rest of the country and vice versa, because this is a very democratic city. So when we think of African Americans and Latinos being primarily Democratic constituency groups, in places where political contestation is between political parties, their level of agreement tends to be much higher, because what's at stake is winning this side versus the other side, and vice versa.
Texas and Florida would be examples of that.
Yeah, well, Texas and Florida is certainly a place where Democratic politics do not dominate the states, obviously. And then there'll be places where even in places like Illinois and Pennsylvania, where you have competitive politics, really kind of closely divided states, or more closely divided states, Black and brown politicians tend to work very closely together. When you get to Los Angeles, there is no meaningful thought that the Republicans are going to control the state legislature after this year's election. Like, no one would believe that. It's likely to be 2/3 or 3/4 Democratic in both chambers. Similarly for the County Board of Supervisors and the City Council. Politics at the local level is often contested over much, much smaller but more relevant items to what people's lives are. So in one-party environments, like this one, the debate is not really about outcomes. The vast majority of constituents and electeds alike agree about the types of policies that they would like. But then it becomes a question of priority, like whose need is addressed first. In an era of scarce resources, do we have enough money to take care of A and B? And that can be the source of political contestation. But I do want to point out that even in a place like Los Angeles, where it's intra-party, intra-coalition politics, the vast majority of Black elected officials in Los Angeles were elected with large majority or supermajority support from Latinos living in their districts. That the level of Black-brown coalition in the city, notwithstanding what you might have read in the Los Angeles Times, is far higher than this deeply, depressingly unfortunate conversation would suggest.
And Miguel, does that track your experience in public life and now in the nonprofit sector? In other words, what has been your sense, beginning with Ed Roybal and Tom Bradley, but in your own personal observation about Black-brown relations in sort of the guiding coalitions of Los Angeles?
Well, I think Gary is right. I mean, we just saw it in a very recent election in a very dominant Latino district in council and representing South Los Angeles. The incumbent Curran Price won overwhelmingly, not just among African Americans, but among Latinos against up and coming Latina. So what's disturbing about the narrative that we're hearing today over the release of this tape is that somehow it is giving a window to a politics that is the dominant politics that nobody talks about. And I'm not going to deny that there isn't racism in the Latino community. There isn't legacy of colorism in the Latino community, or anti-Indigenous sentiment or anti-LGBTQ sentiment. There's an exhibit at La Plaza de Cultura y Artes across from Olvera Street, which Gary Segura serves on the board, that whenever I take visitors, I show them. The Spanish had a caste system that showed you where you fell in the caste system based on your proximity to be pure white. And so, the different blends of indigenous with Spanish, African with Spanish and indigenous, Asian. And so it's a very complicated system that was created, all leading to the goal is to being as pure white as possible. But your position in society was shaped by your proximity to whiteness. And that's how Latin America was founded, on those premises that came from the Spanish. And it's still very prevalent in our community. But having said that, when it comes to the political relationship between the two communities, the example I just gave, where predominantly Latinos voted for an African American council member. And we saw recently in the mayoral race where we had a highly qualified Latino candidate who ran for a mayor, who didn't get the majority, not only didn't get the majority of the Latino vote, he didn't get the majority of his district's vote. More Latinos voted for Karen Bass and for Rick Caruso than they did for Kevin De Leon. So our community is sophisticated enough to understand that being Latino is a factor in our decision-making as to who's the right candidate, but it's not the only factor. And I think that's true for other communities. And so, these alliances, the way they manifest down into the community, have real implications on representation, and don't really play itself out. Antonio Villaraigosa is very clear in crediting his success as mayor, having won a significant part of the African American vote to be able to represent the city, in addition to the Latino vote and the Jewish community and others. So I think we have to be very careful to not sort of take this moment and say, we knew it all along. This is how Latinos think. They're basically MAGA Republicans when it comes down to it. When in fact, what that conversation was about power, and about the seduction that comes with power. And that conversation is very much part of the American tradition around maintaining power, hoarding it at the expense of others. In this context, it happened to be for Latinos who were having it.
Right. Politicians being politicians, they want to make sure that their own self-interests are being protected. There's a story. I'm really absorbing what you're saying. And yet I'm mindful of the fact that there have been very significant demographic transformations in the city. And what I'm particularly thinking of is the significant rise of Latinos and the significant decline of African Americans as part of the demographic pie of Los Angeles, which when we think of overall political representation, could make understandable an undercurrent of resentment on the part of Latinos towards African Americans, whom they believe are overrepresented, as indeed was expressed on that tape. And I'm wondering what we are, to make of that shift in demographic balance and the culture of resentment that it might breed. Because part of what you're suggesting to us is we're doing ourselves a disservice by focusing on sort of the most salacious aspect of the story and really missing larger trends, which, for all of the messiness involved, have yielded working and workable political coalitions between African Americans and Latinos. So how are you feeling? Like the media is sort of missing the real story here, or it's a very complicated prospect, which involves politicians being concerned about their self-interest, but also deeper resentments that have operative consequences. Gary, what do you think we should be thinking?
Well, I mean, so kind of Miguel knows my views on this. I think I'm very frustrated at the moment because the nastiness and utter unacceptability of the conversation that we heard taped has become the focus. But it hasn't actually mooted the underlying question, which is, in a city and county where half the population is Latino, that the city council is 27% Latino and the county board of supervisors is 20% Latino is unjust. That is unjust. Now, whether these particular politicians are seeking and desiring more power than they have, or behaving inappropriately or saying things that we find horrific, that doesn't set aside the underlying question. With respect to who holds power, power does not give itself up voluntarily. And so if you go back to the Villaraigosa-Hahn election in 2001, Miguel's correct in describing Villaraigosa's coalition in 2005, but that coalition didn't exist in 2001, which is why we got a different outcome. Okay, so African American Latino polarization benefits certain political forces in the city, and it's not usually African Americans or Latinos. And so we have to be very careful about the political agendas of those who would stoke the fires and say, there's a long history of resentment, there's a long history of this and that, when in fact, as both Miguel and I pointed out, there's a long history of cooperation and a long history of voting for politicians of the other group when they were found to be meritorious and representative and taking care of the interests of the constituency. So when we hear things about no zero sum, council seats are zero sum. There are 15 of them. If you hold one, I don't. That's just the way that is. But the politics doesn't have to be zero sum. The policy making doesn't have to be zero sum. And actually, Miguel's been far more eloquent than I could be on this topic, and I'll let him take that. But that the seats are there and that they're held by somebody or they're held by somebody else is a reality. And that when people want to start talking now, at precisely the moment that Latinos are 50% of the population, now suddenly we're not supposed to count seats, seems ill-timed and unfortunate, and yet another attempt to diminish Latino political power. So again, behavior terrible, language terrible, underlying question is a valid one.
And you could see what happens when you mitigate or significantly reduce the role in politics in deciding district boundaries. So, the seat that Gloria Molina sat in and now Supervisor Solis sits in, that wasn't handed. It wasn't given up willingly. It resulted out of civil rights litigation that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Board of Supervisors was forced to create a seat, an opportunity seat for Latinos. And not surprising that the only other time that a second opportunity seat was created more recently was when the board was taken out of the decision making. There was an independent body that was created, forced by the state legislature. It didn't come because the board suddenly woke up one day, said we want to change boundaries. And now there are 2 opportunity seats, potentially 3 opportunity seats for Latinos, and the elections of the future will to determine whether that happens. And so, the lesson here is that, and that folks, as Gary said, don't give up power on their own. And it's almost, we're expecting them to be superhuman or angels to somehow put their own self-interests aside for a moment and think of the broader good, and even in some cases, even hurt their own self-interest. Human beings were designed that way. And so, removing them from that process and creating a process that's really informed by data, by research, by experts, by independence, I feel will help create opportunities where our representation at every level of government reflects the communities. Now, having said that, it's what this lesson also tells us is that we could have 100% city council who's Latino and a mayor who's Latino, an entire government controlled by Latinos. And in many cities in the Southeast where I grew up, that's the case. It's important to also say that that's not enough. And this is why it was so important that the Latino community speak up in this crisis, is that we have a responsibility as the majority population at this point to not mirror, not duplicate, not recreate the same approach, zero-sum politics of the past. We have an opportunity and indeed a responsibility to govern with everyone, for everyone, to put the issues of the most vulnerable and the most marginalized at the center of policymaking. And even if it's 100% controlled Latino body, it's not good enough to say, well, I'm brown and you should support me for that. And I think as a community, what this moment has reminded us is that our job is not only to advocate on behalf of the interests of our community, but as important, hold our elected officials accountable when they fail to reflect the values of our community and have fallen victim and have been seduced by the very power that has kept us out in the past. And I'm very proud that our community has stood up very clearly and said that this is not acceptable.
Right. And we're still waiting for the results of that political action to be realized, insofar as you, amongst other Latino leaders, have called for the resignations of all 3 city councilors quoted on the tape. And as of today, only one has resigned her position. But I want to maybe go back to the data points that Gary mentioned, and that we are all very mindful of, which is that almost half, some say 48%, some say more than 48% of the population of the city is Latino. And at present, 3 of 15 council seats are held by Latinos. So, Gary, how do we explain this yawning chasm between this major Latino demographic heft and the underrepresentation in the political realm?
Well, I've given you part of the explanation, which is the political part, right? So there are other political forces in the city that are vying for political influence during the redistricting process. Those voices engage in the same sort of cajoling and elbowing, and they've been successful at that. So that's one part of the process. There's also the very lovely positive part of the process that Miguel pointed out, which is that sometimes Latinos vote for non-Latino candidates because that's their preference, and that's fine. I think we aspire to a representative system where everyone votes for someone that they feel represents them. The other half of the story is a demographic story, which is non-citizens are, of course, not able to vote. I mentioned before that the median age is 27, so a huge portion of the Latino community is not yet 18. And another huge portion are between the ages of 18 and 27, which are people who on average do not vote regularly, and particularly in local elections tend to not vote as frequently. So there's part of a natural maturation process that is holding down Latino political power just because of its relative age, its poverty, and the percent that are foreign born. So those three things together dampen the ability of the demography to lift the community above the margin there in some districts.
And what part anti-brown racism?
I think that is going to be reflected primarily in the rough and tumble of the politics, particularly in districts that are either evenly divided between whites and Latinos, or in the redistricting processes that produce districts that are just marginally not Latino enough to elect a Latino elected official. We saw a lot of really interesting line drawing in this most recent redistricting, unrelated to the conversation that we now have on tape. And then there's a historical example, which you're familiar with, like why is the city of LA shaped the way it is, and what are the neighborhoods and regions of the center part of the county that are not included in the city, and why is that? And so there's a whole set of historical processes that are racially driven, and that serve to dampen Latino political power.
And how do we get to equitable redress? I mean, you suggested that there needs to be some commensurate representation, that is, say, commensurate with the numbers. So should half of the city council seats, do you think, be in the hands of Latinos? Would that be the direction in which you think we need to go?
I would say that half of the city council seats need to be in circumstances where Latino voters can choose their first choice candidate of preference, regardless of that person's race or ethnicity. But perhaps more broadly, I think we need to engage in the institutional reform whereby we draw district lines in ways that reflect cohesive communities, and let those communities elect candidates that they genuinely feel represent their experiences and aspirations, instead of having carefully crafting districts that preserve this incumbent's possibility of holding a seat that really has left them demographically and so forth. Like, if we could get that out of the way and have some genuine institutional reform, we might move in the direction of about half of the seats being places where Latinos have the opportunity to select a first choice candidate.
And let me answer this question slightly different, or maybe frame it differently too. Latino elected officials are not the only ones who could represent Latino interests. And if you look at the school district, okay, where more than 70% of the kids in that school district are Latino, a super majority, the district in all of its policies, in all of its priorities, in its distribution of resources, in everything that it does, it is influencing and impacting the Latino community and the future of it. It's not just the responsibility of the handful of Latino, elected leaders on there to represent their interests. It is all of their responsibility. And I think hopefully we start, when we start thinking about this, our community as now being the majority. And if you want to see what the future of LA looks like, just look at what LA Unified looks like today, is that there's this politics that everyone takes care of their own. And I could only speak on behalf of this group, is a politics that it isn't even practical in a place like Los Angeles, where the population is as diverse as it is. And that's why I think about it very differently, in that by centering the data, which Gary understands well, and we worked together on a project with the Committee for Greater LA, where we highlighted, all driven by data, who are the most marginalized, who are the most likely to die, who are the ones always receiving the bottom of everything in education and healthcare and housing, that the pandemic existed. When you use data to drive decision making, then it doesn't just fall on the responsibility of African Americans and Latinos. It is the dominant politics. That is the politics. And we haven't made that shift yet. We think about it as a special initiative. We think about it, how do we treat those who are most behind? My wife does work with young people to get them to college. She just had a meeting with parents. She was being told to give the presentation in English with headphones for the Spanish speakers. 100% of the audience only spoke Spanish. Then when the one person who came and spoke only English, that person got the headphones. That when we start thinking about things and how they really work in the community, then that helps define so many of the other questions that is much more relevant to how the community thinks of itself, as opposed to how, we frame things at a political level.
And if I could, I want to jump in because you mentioned COVID, and that really helps clarify things. At a superordinate level, the vast majority of issues in Southern California affect Black and Brown citizens alike in exactly the same way. And you could talk about whether or not the school district is doing a good job or the school districts are doing a good job. You could talk about the cost of housing. Black rent and brown rent, both too high for Black and brown families to be able to afford. You can talk about the availability of community college education and its cost and its quality. You can talk about community hospitals and the fact that those community hospitals don't get residents because they're being funded through Medicaid, not Medicare, and the reimbursement rates are different. Therefore, elderly white people are more likely to get higher quality care, ceteris paribus, than younger Black and brown people because of the way the federal government struck. Like on so many issues, the Black political problem and the brown political problem are the political problem.
Right. I mean, I totally understand and deeply appreciate that kind of a capacious and quite magnanimous view of politics. And Miguel, you've given eloquent voice to it today and in your Washington Post op-ed when you talk about the need to break free from hurtful, archaic, zero-sum politics. But as we've discussed, politics is a game of self-interest more often than of common interest. And there's a very real demand for political enfranchisement out there, and the very powerful felt need to overcome long patterns of underrepresentation in the Latino community. And I'm just wondering, whether that's too nice a picture you portray of politics as it should be, given the demands and the anger that animate those demands. Do you think it's possible to get back to what you have described as historical conditions of a Black-Brown coalition in the wake of this episode? Or has something been cracked open that's going to be very hard to reassemble? Has the genie escaped from the bottle?
I don't think that coalition is still in place. As horrible as this moment is, that coalition is in place and those conversations are taking place. And I agree with Miguel. I'm so proud of the way Latino political leaders, Latino civic leaders, Latino activists, and rank and file Latino voters have addressed this by saying this does not speak for us. And we are not in our needs, not your needs, because that is not the framework in which these are functioning. So I completely understand that. And I completely reject the notion that politics necessarily has to be our gain at your expense. The other thought is that if we look at the political arrangements that disadvantage both African Americans and Latinos, there are political issues to be driven, but they're not necessarily between the groups, but between those groups and others. There's a favorite joke of mine from back in the mid-teens about the Koch brothers. And the Koch brothers have put a baker's dozen of cookies on the table. And they took 12 of the 13 cookies. And they look at the white working class guy and they say, that unionized teacher wants your cookie because there's only one cookie left. Like, no, there's a baker's dozen of cookies, and we can all have cookies. So this idea that African Americans and Latinos have to contest for political power over scarce resources, while others in California, others in Los Angeles County and City live very different lives. That's, I think, where the locus of political contestation should be. And to the extent that anyone, including a famous local paper, is ginning up conflict between two groups of people who have very similar life problems, that serves to benefit those who currently hold power and advantage.
And I think the reason why it seems impossible is because, frankly, we have no model. The dominant model, the founding model of this country is zero sum. It was built on power is for some, and to receive the benefits of the democracy, and there are others whose job it is to be in service of that. And so why we feel like we're walking into a dark room is because we are. And I think we have to acknowledge that we are looking to create an opportunity, a redefining what a democracy looks like and how we prioritize issues and decide what success looks like. And success was often defined by how those in power benefited from the power that they had. And those outside of that were irrelevant, frankly. And so we don't have, it's hard for us to say, I want to look like this. I want to be more like that. Because frankly, it doesn't exist. It never has existed in this country, and particularly in Los Angeles. And so it is both an exciting opportunity to think about the moment in time that we're in, that we're redefining what successful politics looks like. But it also creates a huge sense of responsibility. And those in civic leadership and in government and in the business community in this moment in time are doing their own ways, trying to figure it out. And we will make mistakes. We will, but I think the conversation is finally shifting. And to Gary's point, when you simplify it to this is a brown-black conflict that has long existed, or to, Latinos won't be able to govern with the responsibility that comes with being the majority, or, then you're establishing as an expectation that what was done to us, we will do back to others. And the response that has been very clear and organic, not orchestrated, that was grounded in authentic relationships prior to this crisis, has emerged, and it's so loud, but yet so unrecognized. And for me, that is incredibly frustrating, because the politics of the past, which is easy to summarize in a few column inches, is what's defining this moment, which is simply not the reality of what's really happening.
Okay, I want to ask you a final question that follows on what you both just said, and feel free to answer briefly or in more elaborate fashion. The question is, are you confident that we will seize the opportunity that this crisis has generated? I understand you have hopes that we will begin to both return to old patterns and create new ones in ways that will be additive and avoid the zero-sum trap. Are you confident that we will seize the opportunity? Gary?
That's a tough question. I am confident that if we can focus on equality and equity as guideposts, equality of right, equity of treatment, that we have a Los Angeles and a California that's better off for African Americans, Latinos, and indeed everyone else. that our quality of life, our quality of city, our quality of civic congress is better. So I'm confident that that's true. I'm confident that people I respect and people in whom I place trust are working in that direction. So I'm confident that that's happening. Political change is hard. So, how much money would I bet on it? I don't know. But I'm going to try. I know Miguel's going to try. The two of us together have a dozen friends who we know are working on it at this very moment. So I'd say I'm uncharacteristically optimistic. I'm not sure I'd use the word confident.
Miguel?
So this is going to sound a little ironic for someone who spent my entire career in the public sector. If we were relying on government to reform itself, then I have zero confidence. And so there will be efforts. They will get reduced to the most common denominator. They will be sold as being transformative, but they won't really have the long-lasting systemic change that is needed. The reason I'm no longer in government is because I believe that. And so I am confident if the awakening that has emerged from all of us outside of government, if that gets built and maintained and strengthened and focused and intentional and relentless, then I'm confident that this is a moment that will transform the city forever. And so, I think in the conversations I have with folks, both inside of government and outside, it's always with an eye of reminding us of not falling for the easy answer, not trying to simply get through the uncomfortableness that we're in, but actually leaning into it and being reminded of what's most important. And so hearing the grantees that we support on the ground, seeing their work, seeing how they're holding us accountable and their elected officials accountable, that makes me confident that this is a moment that can be transformative.
Well, on that note, I propose that we have a check-in in about 6 months to see where we're at. But for the moment, I'd like to thank Miguel Santana and Gary Segura for just a really stimulating, rich, broad, and candid conversation about the recent events in LA city politics. Thank you to you both for making time out of your busy schedules.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Maya Ferdman, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.